can still hear the soft clinking of crystal glasses, the hum of smooth jazz floating lazily through the house, the one I bought, furnished and filled with warmth for my son. The roast chicken I had marinated the night before simmered in the oven, its scent curling through the air like a promise. I wasn't even supposed to be there that night. Camille had forgotten to mention her parents were coming. Again, and in a scramble to make things look perfect, she asked me to help. Of course I did. I always did. I sliced bread. I polished silverware. I brought up wine from the basement and wiped down the counters while she styled her hair upstairs. And when they finally arrived, I stood quietly at the edge of the dining room like a well-trained dog waiting for a pat that would never come. Her mother looked at me with mild curiosity, her voice sugary and sharp. And you are? Before I could even open my mouth, Camille laughed, flipping her perfectly styled curls over her shoulder and chirped, "Oh, that's Eleanor. Our unofficial maid keeps the house running." The room erupted in laughter. Even Nathaniel, my son, the boy I raised alone, whose diapers I changed, whose scraped knees I kissed, whose tuition I paid with the money I made, cleaning motel bathrooms and restocking supermarket shelves. He laughed, and I stood there holding the empty wine bottle like it was the only thing tethering me to this earth. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I smiled the kind of polite, brittle smile you learn to wear when the only alternative is screaming. I turned, set the bottle on the counter, with hands I couldn't feel anymore, and walked slowly toward the bedroom I painted myself when we first moved in. They kept laughing behind me. Not one of them, not my son, not Camille, not her parents, said a word to stop it. Not one of them said, "That's my mother." I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the door, my mind looping through years of sacrifices, every dream I gave up, every job I worked, every time I said yes when I wanted to say no. A bone-deep grief and anger pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I wasn't just humiliated, I was erased, like I had never mattered, like my love had been a transaction they didn't even bother to repay with dignity. And underneath all of that, in the quiet hours of the night, came the fear. What now? Who was I if not Nathaniel's mother? If not the woman who held everything together with invisible thread? The terror of being unnecessary carved itself into my bones. That night, something inside me died, and in its place, something cold and quiet began to form. Not rage, not yet, but the first flicker of awakening, a dangerous, echoing clarity I wouldn't recognize until much later. The truth was, I had been alone for a long time. I just hadn't admitted it to myself until that moment. Morning came with the same dull light spilling across the floorboards, but everything in me felt irrevocably changed. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, making coffee out of habit, feeding the cat Camille only pretended to like when guests were over. She swept in wearing yoga pants and a smug air, glued to her phone as always, not even offering a glance, let alone a greeting. I waited. Just stood there in the doorway, hands trembling around a ring of keys that suddenly felt heavier than the years I'd carried them. She finally looked up, confused, annoyed, as if I were interrupting her curated morning. "What's this?" she asked, her perfect brow furrowed, manicured fingers reaching for the keys. "Good luck paying the mortgage," I said, calm but gutted, watching her blink in slow realization. Then I turned and walked down the hallway lined with the framed photographs I had hung, the furniture I had chosen, the wallpaper I once excitedly picked out for our home. I didn't take anything. Not a book, not a plate. Just my purse and the worn coat I had on the day I brought Nathaniel home from the hospital. My hands felt numb, and my throat burned with unspoken grief, but I kept walking. Nathaniel called after me, finally, but it was too late. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. He ran barefoot down the driveway, his voice cracked and uncertain, but I only heard it as noise. I didn't slam the car door. I closed it slowly, deliberately, because everything else in me was splintering, and I needed just one action that felt controlled. Inside, my stomach churned with anxiety so fierce I thought I might throw up. Was I really doing this? Leaving my child? My life? My identity? But what life? What identity? I had been reduced to background noise, an unpaid servant, a burden dressed in familiarity. I had become disposable. I drove to the apartment Aunt Thelma had left me, a place I hadn't seen in years, and when I opened the door, I was met with the stale scent of age and neglect. The heater groaned to life, the wallpaper peeled in the corners, and the floor creaked beneath my feet like a question I couldn't yet answer. I set my bag on the dusty table and stood still, hollowed out. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just breathed in silence so thick it rang in my ears. That night, I lay on the couch. The bed frame in the bedroom was broken, and stared at the cracked ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. Because if I did, I might see Nathaniel's face. Or worse, remember how easily he had laughed while I was dying inside. Grief choked me, but beneath it pulsed something darker. Helplessness. I had nothing. No plan. No one calling to check on me. Not even a text. It was then that the loneliness settled in completely. Not just as a feeling, but as a presence. Cold and total. And in that darkness, I began to understand. I hadn't just walked away from them. I had walked away from a version of myself that was never truly seen. It started with a dead light bulb. I opened the upstairs storage closet in Aunt Thelma's apartment, expecting to find boxes of dusty linens or old coats. But tucked behind a pile of yellowing magazines was something else. A rusted metal trunk with a tarnished clasp and a weight that felt oddly intentional. My heart quickened as I pulled it out, dust puffing into the air, my fingers trembling with a strange, unspoken dread. I pried it open, expecting to find sewing supplies or old letters, but instead, I found the end of everything I thought I knew. There were envelopes, dozens of them, and on top, one in Thelma's familiar cursive, addressed to me. If you're reading this, you came back. And I'm so sorry. My breath hitched. The letter was fragile. The ink slightly faded, but clear. She wrote about working as a nurse at the hospital where I gave birth to Nathaniel. How she'd always felt something was wrong that night. Last-minute room changes, a nurse she'd never seen before handling the tags on newborns, and then silence. No one wanted to talk about it, and by the time she raised her concerns, the babies had already been sent home. Still, something gnawed at her for decades, until years later, she stumbled across a quiet settlement between the hospital and another family. Buried in her files was a DNA report and a photo of a different baby. A boy named Thomas Avery. My son. I remember clutching the paper so tightly it nearly tore. The room spun. The breath left my lungs like someone had punched me. My knees gave out, and I sank to the floor, surrounded by documents I didn't want to believe, but couldn't deny. Shock twisted into horror, a lifetime of memories suddenly repainted with a cruel, accidental brushstroke. Nathaniel was not my child, not biologically, not legally, and yet I had built my entire life around him, poured every ounce of myself into loving him, sacrificing for him, needing nothing in return but the dignity of being seen. I stared at the photo, Thomas wrapped in a soft hospital blanket, the name scrawled across the back in Thelma's handwriting. Grief overwhelmed me, but not just for the child I never knew. I grieved for myself, for the woman who had given everything to a child who never felt like hers, who had stood confused for years, wondering why the bond never quite felt complete. The anger rose next, fierce and hollow, not at Nathaniel, not even at the hospital, but at the cruel randomness of fate, at the fact that a moment of carelessness had cost me a life I never got to live. And beneath it all, fear sank its teeth in. What now? Could I ever tell either of them? What did this truth mean for the years I'd lost? for the identity I had built on falsehood? I curled up on the floor, trunk wide open, papers scattered around me like shards of a mirror reflecting a stranger's life. And I wept, not loudly, but with the soundless ache of a woman who had just lost the only story she'd ever known. I saw him before I was ready. Thomas Avery, my son, though he didn't know it. He stood behind the glass of his bookstore on the corner of Main and Elm, arranging paperbacks on a display shelf. The sunlight filtered through the window, catching the frames of his glasses, casting soft shadows across the hardwood floors. He moved with quiet assurance, nodding kindly to a customer, offering a smile so warm it knocked the air from my lungs. I stood across the street, paralyzed, clutching a coffee I no longer remembered buying. My feet wouldn't move. My heart pounded. I didn't dare step closer. Not yet. The idea of walking in and speaking to him, of shattering the life he thought he knew, filled me with terror so sharp it made me physically ill. I turned away quickly, the tears coming faster than I could blink them back. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay curled on Aunt Thelma's old couch, the file folder pressed to my chest like a life vest. I played out every possible conversation in my mind. None of them ended well. What words could possibly make sense of this? "You don't know me, but I'm your mother." No matter how I framed it, it sounded absurd, cruel even. My stomach churned with anxiety, my mind cycling endlessly through the details I'd read. Hospital files, dates, birth weights, photographs. It was real. He was mine, and yet he wasn't. Not really. The next day, I returned. I sat on the bench across the street, pretending to scroll my phone, to sip coffee, to just exist. I watched him move through his day with a rhythm that felt eerily familiar. He laughed with an older woman carrying a tote bag full of poetry books. He crouched to pet a dog tied to a bike rack. And I felt this indescribable sadness, a grief not just for the son I never got to raise, but for the hundreds of moments like these I had missed. Soccer games, broken bones, first dates, bad report cards, birthday candles, all of it, gone, taken, stolen. Every evening I returned to my apartment carrying the unbearable weight of observation. The helplessness clung to me, a cloak I couldn't shake. I was invisible again, but this time to the person who should have known me most. I kept writing in my journal, trying to contain the waves of emotion. The loneliness was deafening. And yet, I couldn't look away. I began tracking Nathaniel and Camille too. Camille's social media painted a picture of abundance and balance, lavish brunches, rented office spaces, filtered perfection. But I saw through it. It made me sick, the way they thrived on lies, while I sat in silence, watching a life I should have had. So I wrote. Not just grief, but details, names, patterns, transactions. Because if I couldn't reclaim the past, maybe I could prepare for what came next. Watching Thomas wasn't just mourning anymore. It was strategy. And buried beneath all the despair and disgust, something else flickered. Something close to purpose. At first, the journal was nothing more than a container for my grief. Old spiral notebooks with dog-eared covers, the kind I used to buy for Nathaniel when he was in school, believing he'd use them to chase a future I was funding with every ounce of myself. Now, I filled them alone in the dim light of Aunt Thelma's apartment, my pen digging into the paper like I could etch the pain away if I pressed hard enough. I wrote everything I was too afraid to say out loud, how I used to wait in the kitchen for a simple thank you that never came, how I'd cry in the garage while they went out to dinner, pretending I was asleep so I wouldn't have to hear their muffled laughter through the walls I painted. Sadness and despair bled from every page, and still, it wasn't enough to quiet the ache. But something shifted after the fifth notebook. I found myself writing less about what I felt and more about what I saw, about Camille's social media posts that didn't match the reality of their lives, about Nathaniel's sudden disappearance from the workforce, about the brand Camille built that seemed to be all smoke and hashtags. It started with just a note or two, then names, then dates, then business filings, LLC registrations, screenshots of luxury office spaces I discovered were hourly rentals. Shock turned to disgust as I realized how meticulously they had crafted their lie, and how easily I had funded it, all while they laughed at me behind wine glasses in the home I paid for. The helplessness was back, but it felt different this time. Sharper. Louder. I wasn't mourning anymore. I was documenting betrayal. I tracked every inconsistency, every discrepancy in Camille's so-called coaching business. She had no real clients. Her success stories were thinly veiled fabrications propped up by paid followers and fake testimonials. Meanwhile, Nathaniel, my son, or so I had believed, sat in the shadows of her spotlight, living off the wealth I had bled for. It made me physically ill. Some nights I couldn't eat. Some nights I woke up gasping, paralyzed by the fear that maybe none of it would ever matter. That even if I had proof, no one would care. That maybe I was still just the maid in everyone's story, even in my own. But then, I'd return to the bench outside Thomas's bookstore, journal in hand, and watch him through the glass. Gentle, soft-spoken, real, and I'd remember what truth felt like, what it looked like. I didn't write about him the way I did about Nathaniel and Camille. My notes about Thomas weren't weapons, they were windows. Details of his favorite books, the way he always gave customers time, how he smiled like kindness wasn't rare. And in those quiet notations, the loneliness that had swallowed me began to loosen its grip. Just a little. The grief was still there. The anger burned like coals under my skin. But now, I had a weapon I never thought I'd wield: knowledge. The journal was no longer my grave. It had become my map. And I wasn't lost anymore. I was navigating. The first time I saw Thomas up close, it was raining. The sidewalk shimmered with reflected streetlight, and I had lingered too long outside his bookstore, pretending to check the weather app, pretending I had somewhere to be. He was inside, restocking the biography section, humming a tune under his breath. His voice was soft, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and when he turned toward the window and saw me standing there, our eyes met. He smiled, warm, welcoming, the kind of smile you offer a stranger who might need it. It undid me. My hands started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped my umbrella. I turned away abruptly, ducking behind the corner of the building, my chest heaving, stomach knotted. Fear ripped through me like ice water. That smile, that gentleness, it belonged to me, and yet it didn't. He didn't know. He couldn't know. And I didn't know how to tell him that everything he believed about his beginning was wrong. I went home soaked to the bone, clothes clinging to me like regret. I collapsed onto the floor of Aunt Thelma's apartment and cried, not just from sadness, but from the unbearable grief of proximity without connection. I had watched Thomas from a distance for weeks, learning the cadence of his life, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of his presence. He was kind without obligation, gentle without motive. Everything I had tried to teach Nathaniel, Thomas lived instinctively, and that realization that the nature I had yearned for wasn't nurtured, but inborn, devastated me. The next time I went into the store, I bought a book I didn't need just to hear his voice again. "Good choice," he said, smiling as he handed me the receipt. "Hard to find these days." His fingertips brushed mine for a second, fleeting, electric, and I swallowed a sob. My mind screamed, "You're mine," but my lips said nothing. I left with the bag clutched against my chest like a lifeline. The helplessness was crushing, to be so close to him and yet have no place in his world. We began to speak more after that. Casual moments, shared smiles, small talk about weather and worn-out paperbacks. He remembered me. Not as a mother. Not yet. Just as someone who came back. Someone who stayed. "You remind me of someone," he said one day, tilting his head, eyes narrowed in thought. "Someone I can't place." I smiled, hollow and breaking. "Maybe a librarian." He laughed gently. "Maybe." Each time I left, I walked into a fog of loneliness and aching what-ifs. What if I had raised him? What if he'd been the boy I'd tucked into bed, taught to ride a bike, sent off to college? What if I had known a love that didn't humiliate me, that didn't ask me to vanish for someone else's comfort? I returned to the apartment and wrote it all down, pages heavy with grief and longing, fury and resignation. Nathaniel had my years. But Thomas, he had my heart, even if he never knew it. The idea came to me one morning while stirring cold tea in Aunt Thelma's kitchen, my journal open beside me, pages covered in notes and receipts and screenshots. I had spent weeks gathering it all. Camille's fabricated testimonials, her unpaid taxes, the fake clients she claimed had transformed under her coaching. Her so-called business, Camille Ascends, was nothing but glitter over rot. For years, I had watched her parade around in silk robes and curated captions while I scrubbed dishes in the house I bought. She lived on lies, and I had paid for them. The disgust I felt reading through her fraudulent LLC filings was bottomless. She wasn't just deceitful. She was dangerous, a manipulator cloaked in mindfulness quotes and detox smoothies, wearing a polished smile while she chipped away at my worth with every breath. I didn't want revenge. Not in the way people imagine it. I didn't want screaming matches or public takedowns. I wanted truth to speak for itself. So I packaged the evidence in a brown envelope and mailed it anonymously to the people who once laughed at me in my own kitchen, Camille's parents. No note, no explanation, just a single message scrawled on the top page. Everything you think you know is a performance. The silence that followed was oppressive. I didn't know when it would hit or how. For 3 days, nothing happened. I began to wonder if maybe they'd dismissed it, or worse, believed the lies over the evidence. Anxiety sat on my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. Had I gone too far? Would this backfire? Then, one morning, Camille's Instagram account went completely silent. No sunrise smoothie routine, no filtered yoga sessions. Just a blank screen where her world used to be. By the week's end, her website quietly vanished. Her upcoming empowerment retreat was canceled due to unexpected restructuring. And then came the ripple. The whispers, the unsubscribes, the comments questioning her credentials. Camille tried to post through it, offering vague affirmations about being misunderstood, but her tone had changed. The cracks were showing, and for once, no filter could fix them. I learned from an old neighbor that Camille's mother had been seen storming out of their house in a rage, phone pressed to her ear, screaming about betrayal. I imagined her standing in the same kitchen where she once sipped wine while I was introduced as the Maid, and I felt nothing, no joy, just a strange, quiet emptiness. Nathaniel called. I didn't answer. The voicemail trembled with panic. "Mom, did you do this? Camille's parents won't speak to us. Everything's falling apart." His voice cracked on the last sentence, and for a second, I closed my eyes. There was sadness, yes, but also a bitter satisfaction. He was finally standing on the edge of the collapse, staring into the abyss I had lived in for years. But the truth was, I wasn't doing this to them. I was doing something for myself. For the years they took. For the woman they discarded. For the silence they mistook for consent. And for once, it was their turn to live with the consequences, while I watched from a place they never imagined I'd rise to. The knock was soft. 3 hesitant raps that barely echoed through Aunt Thelma's apartment. I froze mid-step, a mug of tea cooling in my hand. I didn't need to look through the peephole. I knew that knock. I had heard it in my dreams, in the quiet space between memory and regret. When I did check, there he was. Nathaniel, my son in name if not by blood, standing on the other side of the door with sunken eyes, unshaven cheeks, and a wrinkled shirt that looked like it had been slept in. He didn't knock again. He just stood there, the weight of collapse hanging from his shoulders. I waited a full minute before I opened the door, the silence between us stretching like wire. He looked at me and whispered, "Mom, please, can I come in?" I stepped aside wordlessly. He entered like a man unsure of his place in the world, eyes scanning the space that was too small, too quiet, too full of truths he had never bothered to learn. He sat down slowly on the edge of the armchair, like it might reject him. I remained standing, heart pounding, jaw tight, fists clenched so tightly my fingernails bit into my palms. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, voice cracking, eyes pleading. "To us?" The words hit me like a slap, and for a second I couldn't breathe. Us? The sheer audacity. The disgust rose so quickly I tasted it in the back of my throat. I sat down across from him, keeping my back straight, my tone calm. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said slowly. "I'm finally doing something for me." He looked away, blinking fast. "You're selling the house," he said, like the thought still hadn't solidified. "The house I grew up in. You just gave it away." "No," I corrected. "I gave you everything. The house, the food, the love. And you gave me nothing but silence. You watched her humiliate me in my own kitchen. You laughed." His mouth opened, then shut again. He couldn't deny it. He didn't try. "I thought you were being dramatic," he mumbled. "I didn't know it hurt you that much." That sentence cracked something deep inside me, a mix of sadness, fury, and utter despair. "That's the problem, Nathaniel. You never knew. You never bothered to ask." He hung his head. "I've lost everything." "No," I said. "You gave it away." Then I stood and walked to the drawer where I kept Aunt Thelma's envelope. I handed it to him without explanation. "Read this," I said, "and listen." He opened it slowly. As he read the letter, the DNA results, the hospital records, I watched the color drain from his face. His hands trembled. "This can't be real," he whispered. "It is. So I'm not—" "You weren't born to me," I said quietly, "but I raised you as if you were." He couldn't speak. His identity, his foundation, everything had just shattered. And I felt no joy, no vengeance, just a quiet emptiness that came from finally saying what had never been spoken. When he asked, "Can we fix this?" I met his gaze. "I don't know," I said, "but it's not my job to try anymore." Then I closed the door. Gently, firmly. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one begging to be let in. The day I decided to tell Thomas the truth, the sky was pale and heavy with the kind of clouds that never cry, just hang there, suffocating. I walked to the bookstore in a fog, the envelope clutched in my hands like it might burn through my fingers. My chest felt tight, each breath shallow, as though I were about to commit an irreversible act, and I was. This wasn't just a confession. This was the dismantling of a life, his and mine. Thomas stood behind the counter, rearranging a display of poetry collections. When he saw me, he smiled the way he always did. Warm, curious, effortlessly kind. That smile sliced straight through me. It was the kind of smile you only get from someone who doesn't yet know what you're about to destroy. "I actually came to talk," I said, my voice trembling. He studied me, sensing something deeper in my tone, and nodded slowly. "Sure, come on back." He led me through a small side door into a cramped break room that smelled like peppermint tea and ink. There was a chipped table and a mismatched sofa. Intimate, imperfect, painfully real. I sat down and took a breath I didn't feel. "I've been coming here for a reason," I said, "and it's not the books." His brows lifted slightly, more curious than alarmed. I figured, "You're not exactly here for the discounts." I gave a small, broken laugh. Then I placed the envelope on the table between us. "This is going to change everything," I whispered. He looked down, confused, then up again, searching my face. "What is it?" 30-something years ago, I gave birth to a son, or at least, I thought I did. The air thickened, the silence pulsing. There was a mistake at the hospital, a switch. My child was given to another family, and theirs was given to me. His body stilled completely, like a photograph. I couldn't read his face, and that terrified me more than if he'd screamed. Slowly, with trembling hands, he opened the envelope. Inside were the hospital forms, the DNA results, Aunt Thelma's letter, the entire truth laid bare. He read in silence, and I sat there, suffocating in the quiet, each second dragging like a lifetime. I watched his eyes move across the pages, watched confusion bleed into disbelief, and disbelief morph into something I couldn't name. When he finally looked up, his voice was low, raw. "You're saying I'm your son?" I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know." He stared at the papers, fingers pressed into the edges like he needed to hold on to something solid. "I don't know how to feel," he admitted. "I love the parents who raised me. But this, I would never ask you to stop loving them," I said. "I just couldn't keep this buried. I've been living in silence for so long, and it was starting to kill me." He was quiet for a long time. Then finally, he looked at me with eyes glistening, but not cold. "Can we take this slow?" It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't family. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And in that moment, the loneliness cracked, just a little. The house sold faster than I expected. Full asking price, no counteroffers. Just like that, it was done. The place I had once called home, the place where I measured Nathaniel's height on the kitchen doorframe, where I hand-painted the hallway and folded laundry while dreaming of a future I thought we shared, was gone. Except it never truly belonged to them, did it? Camille may have curated it into a showroom for her lies, and Nathaniel may have laid claim to its comforts. But I was the one who built it, funded it, preserved it. Every dollar, every tile, every whispered prayer over late bills and maxed-out cards, it had all been mine. And now, finally, legally, it was mine again to release. And I did, without ceremony, without goodbye, just a signature, a key, a quiet end to a chapter soaked in anguish, betrayal, and unbearable grief. When the moving truck pulled up, I didn't go inside. I stood down the block in my car, engine off, heart thudding. I watched from behind the tinted glass as Camille barked orders at the movers, her voice clipped, her sunglasses hiding whatever was left of her composure. Even from a distance, I could see the cracks. Her movements were frantic, her gestures sharper than usual. Gone was the woman who hosted wine tastings in silk robes. Gone was the woman who laughed while I stood, empty-handed, in my own kitchen. Now she was a woman packing a life that never really belonged to her into boxes she probably couldn't afford. Nathaniel stood on the lawn, pacing with his phone to his ear, face pale and gaunt. There was no fight left in him. That realization pierced me deeper than I wanted to admit. Not because I pitied him, but because I recognized that look. The hollow defeat. I had worn it for years, and now it belonged to him. Later, my lawyer confirmed the sale had closed. Camille had tried to contest it, citing contributions, but she had no receipts, no payments, no stake. "Let her prove it in court," my lawyer had said with a smile. She couldn't. She wouldn't. All she had were Instagram filters and overdrawn accounts. The mask she wore had finally shattered, and for once, I didn't have to say a word. The house was gone, but it haunted me. Not the structure, but the life I'd given away inside it. the dreams I bent myself to fit, the isolation I endured in silence. And yet, when I walked through my old neighborhood one final time, passing the park where Nathaniel once played, the school I volunteered at, the grocery store where I clipped coupons just to buy his favorite cereal, I felt something unfamiliar. Release. Because I wasn't walking away in shame. Not this time. I was leaving the grave of a woman who gave everything and received nothing in return. And as the distance grew between me and that porch swing where I once sat unseen, so did the faint, flickering feeling that maybe, just maybe, peace was finally within reach. I always thought the word freedom belonged to speeches and stories, not to women like me. Not to women who lived in the margins, who raised ungrateful sons, and disappeared into the wallpaper of their own lives. But that morning, as I stepped into Thomas's bookstore and saw him standing near the back wall beneath a wooden sign that read, "The Next Chapter," something shifted. My breath caught. My throat closed. The sign hung above a small, arched doorway I hadn't noticed before. And when he turned to me, eyes soft and certain, I felt the old, familiar ache rise again. The ache of grief and longing, but also something else. Fear. What now? Could I trust this? Could I trust him? My feet moved forward anyway, cautious but pulled by something I hadn't felt in years, hope so faint it frightened me. He held out a small brass key, polished but simple, like something from a forgotten drawer. "It's for you," he said quietly. "I'm opening this space, a reading corner, community gatherings, quiet talks, but I want you to have it for as long as you want." I stared at the key, at the door, at the shelves already half filled with classics and memoirs, a small table with a tea set near the window. It didn't feel like a store. It felt like belonging, and that terrified me. What if I didn't deserve it? What if it disappeared the moment I let my guard down? "You don't have to do this," I whispered, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. I felt raw, stripped bare, like that woman in the kitchen again, holding a wine bottle while they laughed. "I know," he said, "but I want to." His voice didn't carry obligation. There was no pity in his eyes, just quiet recognition. Not of the mother he never had, or the woman who had lived in his shadowed beginnings, but of me, Eleanor, a woman who had been discarded, betrayed, forgotten, and had lived to write again. As I turned the key in the lock, my hands shook. I stepped inside and stood still in the center of the room, the scent of wood and ink and something almost like peace washing over me. I didn't say anything. I just breathed, and in that silence, I felt something begin to settle inside me, something that had fought to be heard for decades. That night, I opened my old notebook and turned to the final blank page. I wrote slowly, deliberately. I was a woman who gave until she vanished. Now, I am a woman who returned, not with fire or fury, but with silence, with truth, with a strength they never saw coming. Later, I finalized the donation. A portion of the house sale went to a women's foundation, one that helps the discarded start again. They called to thank me, but I didn't need thanks. I needed only what I finally had in my hand, a key, not to someone else's house, not to someone else's life, but to mine. And this time, it opened a door no one else could close. This story is a poignant reminder that it is never too late to reclaim one's worth, no matter how long you've been dismissed, silenced, or overlooked. Eleanor's journey speaks directly to those who have given endlessly, to children, to spouses, to family, only to find themselves alone, unacknowledged, and emptied. Her quiet transformation teaches us that true strength isn't found in loud declarations or revenge, but in the dignity of walking away, in the courage to begin again, and in the power of truth, even when it arrives late in life. For older adults, especially those who've spent years in roles of caregiver or sacrifice, This story offers a powerful lesson. You are not defined by who left, who forgot, or who failed to see you. You are defined by what you choose to do next. Healing can begin at any age, and sometimes the most radical act of self-love is simply to say, "No more," and hand yourself the key to a life that finally belongs to you. Peace may arrive quietly, but when it does, it's yours to keep. Not because someone gave it to you, but because you claimed it for yourself.